An original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Lady Imogen Vale stands near the window of Westmere House, her gloved hands folded carefully before her, watching the candlelight flicker across polished floors as laughter ripples through the crowded salon. She has perfected the art of being present, without being seen, attending events with the practiced grace of a woman who knows that survival lies in discretion. Then a woman's voice cuts through the room, playful and probing, directed at the Duke himself. "How many women have you loved?" The salon quiets. Crystal paused midair, and Julian Harrowmere, Duke of Westmere, shifts his gaze, briefly, deliberately, to where Imogen stands in shadow. His answer comes without hesitation. "One." The woman presses, delighted. "Who?" And he replies, his voice carrying across the hushed space. "The one asking stupid questions." Laughter follows, but Imogen feels something shift beneath her ribs, an exposure she did not seek, a protection she did not request, and the sudden, unsettling awareness that she has just been named, without being named at all. Lady Imogen Vale had learned to survive by being unseen. In the sharp-edged world of London society, a visible widow was a vulnerable one. She attended events with practiced courtesy, spoke only when addressed, and left before anyone remembered she was there. Her late husband's ruin, swift, silent, unexplained, had taught her that safety lay in discretion. She had refined invisibility into an art. When the invitation to the benefit evening at Westmere House arrived, she nearly declined. The Duke of Westmere was known for his sharp wit and sharper boundaries, but the cause was worthy, and refusing would draw more attention than attending. The evening unfolded as expected. Polite conversation, muted laughter, the clink of crystal against crystal. Imogen stood near a tall window overlooking the gardens, observing rather than participating. The salon was warm with candlelight, the air thick with perfume, and the soft murmur of voices. She recognized most of the guests: Lady Pemberton with her calculating smile, Lord Ashford, and his tiresome anecdotes, the usual assembly of people who said much and revealed little. She was preparing to make her exit, calculating the precise moment when her departure would cause the least disruption, when a voice rose above the others. "Your Grace, you must settle a wager for us." It was Lady Thornbury, a widow of a different sort, one who wore her status like armor and wielded social capital with precision. She stood near the fireplace, her silk gown catching the light, her expression one of practiced innocence. "How many women have you loved?" The room did not fall silent all at once. It was more gradual than that, conversations trailing off, heads turning, attention sharpening. The question hung in the air like smoke. Julian Harrowmere, Duke of Westmere, stood with one hand resting on the mantelpiece. He was a man of perhaps 35, tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to assess everything and reveal nothing. His reputation preceded him: brilliant, wealthy, unmarried by choice, and possessed of a wit that could draw blood without raising his voice. He did not smile. His gaze shifted briefly to where Imogen stood by the window. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds, no more. Then he looked back at Lady Thornbury. Lady Thornbury's smile widened. She had expected deflection, perhaps, or one of his famous evasions. This was better. This was theater. "Who?" Julian's expression remained perfectly neutral. When he spoke, his voice carried across the room with absolute clarity. "The one asking stupid questions." Laughter rippled through the salon, but it was not unkind. It was the laughter of relief, of tension broken, of a social game expertly played. Lady Thornbury pressed one hand to her chest in mock offense, her eyes bright with amusement. Others joined in the merriment, raising glasses, offering quips of their own. But Imogen did not laugh. She stood very still, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass. The Duke had not looked at her again. He had turned to accept a fresh drink from a footman, his manner easy, his attention already shifting to the next conversation. Yet she felt something shift inside her chest, an exposure she had not sought, a protection she had not requested. He had just named her, without naming her at all. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Imogen moved through the required pleasantries, accepted compliments on her gown, discussed the weather and the season's charitable efforts. But beneath it all, she felt the weight of attention, subtle, speculative, interested. When she finally departed, stepping into the cool night air, and climbing into her carriage. She found herself replaying the moment, over and over, the way his gaze had found hers, the precision of his answer, the laughter that followed. She told herself it meant nothing, a moment of wit, nothing more. The Duke was known for such performances. Yet as her carriage rattled through the dark streets toward her modest townhouse, she could not shake the feeling that something had changed, that she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. And she was not certain whether that terrified her or relieved her. 2 days later, a note arrived. It was brief, formal, and unexpected. The handwriting was precise, the paper heavy and cream-colored. Imogen broke the seal with careful fingers and read, "Lady Vale, I am hosting a small gathering at Westmere House on Thursday evening. Your presence would be most welcome. The company will be limited, the purpose informal. I hope you will consider attending. Yours in respect, Westmere." She read it twice, searching for hidden meaning in the careful phrasing. There was nothing overtly improper about the invitation. It was courteous, neutral, exactly what one might expect from a duke extending hospitality to an acquaintance. Yet something about it felt deliberate. She considered declining. It would be safer, simpler. She had worked hard to build a life of quiet dignity, and accepting such an invitation risked disturbing that carefully maintained equilibrium. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, won out. She accepted. When she arrived at Westmere House on Thursday evening, the atmosphere was markedly different from the benefit. Fewer guests, softer voices, a sense of intimacy rather than performance. The salon was lit by candles rather than chandeliers, and the conversation flowed with less formality. Julian greeted her at the door himself, a gesture that surprised her. His manner was courteous but reserved, his dark eyes assessing her with the same careful attention she had noticed before. "Lady Vale, thank you for coming. Your Grace, thank you for the invitation." They stood for a moment in the entrance hall, the sounds of conversation drifting from the salon beyond. He did not move to escort her immediately. Instead, he seemed to be weighing something, considering words he had not yet spoken. "I hope the other evening was not uncomfortable for you," he said finally. Imogen met his gaze steadily. It was unexpected. "Yes, I imagine it was. Was that your intention?" A faint smile touched his lips, not quite amusement, but something close to acknowledgement. "My intention was to redirect an intrusive question. If it caused you discomfort, I apologize. And if it did not, then I am pleased to have been of service." It was a careful dance, this conversation. Each word measured, each response calibrated. Yet beneath the formality, Imogen sensed something genuine, a question unasked, an apology offered without quite being spoken. They joined the others in the salon. The evening unfolded with quiet grace, thoughtful conversation, good wine, the kind of company that did not require constant performance. Imogen found herself relaxing in a way she had not anticipated, drawn into discussions of literature and music, and the tiresome predictability of the social season. Julian was an attentive host, moving between guests with practiced ease. Yet she noticed that he returned to her side more often than strictly necessary, that his attention lingered when she spoke, that he listened with an intensity that felt both flattering and unsettling. Later, as the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, he walked with her to the entrance hall. A footman brought her cloak, and Julian took it from him, draping it over her shoulders with careful hands. As he adjusted the fabric, his fingers brushed the edge of her glove, a small contact, barely there, yet somehow significant. He paused, then reached down and adjusted the button at her wrist, securing it with precise movements. His fingers were careful, deliberate. He did not meet her eyes. "You are welcome here," he said quietly, "if you ever tire of being invisible." Imogen's breath caught. She looked at him, this careful, guarded man who had just spoken a truth she had not expected, and found herself without words. He stepped back, his expression neutral once more. "Good evening, Lady Vale. Good evening, Your Grace." As she stepped into the cool night air, her heart beating faster than it should, she realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, she had been truly seen, and she was not certain what to do with that knowledge. In the days that followed, Imogen found herself returning to Westmere House, more often than propriety, strictly required. There were small gatherings, quiet afternoons in the library, moments of conversation that felt less like performance and more like truth. Julian was not what she had expected. His wit, so sharp in public, softened in private. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words were measured, as though he weighed the cost of each one. She began to notice things. The way he avoided certain topics, the way he deflected praise, the way he watched people as though he was waiting for them to accuse him of something. He was a man who had learned to live at a distance from himself. One afternoon, she found him in the portrait gallery. It was a long room, lined with paintings of Harrowmere ancestors stretching back generations. The light was soft, filtered through tall windows, and the air smelled faintly of beeswax and old wood. Julian stood before a large portrait of a stern-faced man in formal dress, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. Imogen approached slowly, her footsteps quiet, on the polished floor. "Your father?" she asked. "Yes." The man in the painting had Julian's dark eyes and sharp features, but there was a hardness to his expression that Julian lacked, or perhaps had learned to hide. He wore his wealth like armor, every detail of his clothing precise, his bearing one of absolute authority. Julian did not move. He stared at the portrait, as though it were a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. "I thought silence was penance," he said quietly. "I was wrong." Imogen stepped closer, standing beside him. "Penance for what?" He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet, almost clinical. "My father built his fortune on loans. Respectable ones, by law. Ruinous ones, by result. He never broke a rule. He simply understood how to bend them until they broke others." Imogen's breath caught. She knew what he was describing. The kind of financial maneuvering that destroyed families, quietly, legally, without scandal or consequence. Her own husband had fallen victim to such schemes, though she had never known the source. "And you?" she asked carefully. "I inherited his wealth, and his debts, though not the kind that appear in ledgers." She understood then. The restraint, the refusal to accept praise, the careful distance he kept from everyone, including himself. "How long have you been repaying them?" she asked. "Long enough to know that guilt is a poor substitute for justice." He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw something raw in his expression, not shame, but a kind of exhausted honesty. "Your husband," he said carefully. "His name was on one of those loans." The room tilted. Imogen steadied herself against the wall, her hand pressing against cool plaster. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrevocable. "You knew?" "Not until after, when I began auditing the estate. I have been trying to make it right, quietly, without telling me." He nodded. Imogen did not know what she felt. Anger, relief, grief for something she had thought long buried. Her husband's ruin had been swift and inexplicable. He had died 6 months later, his health broken by stress and shame. She had spent years rebuilding her life from the wreckage, never knowing why it had happened, never understanding the invisible forces that had destroyed them. And now this man, this careful, burdened man, was telling her that he had known all along. "I did not want your forgiveness," Julian said quietly. "I wanted to deserve it." She looked at him for a long moment, taking in the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he held himself, as though braced for judgment. "That is not the same thing," she said finally. "I know." They stood in silence, the portraits of dead Harrowmeres watching from the walls. Imogen felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. This man had been punishing himself for years, trying to atone for sins he had not committed, carrying the weight of his father's choices as though they were his own. "What have you done?" she asked. "To make it right." "Reduced the estate's income, redirected funds to families affected by the loans, anonymously in most cases. Some accepted, some refused, some never knew. And my family. Your husband's debts were forgiven. The property that was to be seized was returned to his estate. It was sold after his death, but the proceeds went to you." Imogen remembered that sale. She had thought it a small mercy, a final stroke of luck in a long series of misfortunes. She had never questioned it. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because I did not want gratitude. I wanted justice. And justice, I thought, required silence. But silence is not justice. Imogen said quietly. It is only fear. Julian's expression shifted, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, as though the words had failed him. Imogen turned away from the portrait, facing him fully. You have been hiding, Your Grace. Not from the world, from yourself. I know. Then stop. It was not a command. It was an invitation. Julian looked at her. This quiet, dignified woman who had every reason to hate him, who had instead offered him something he had not known how to ask for, and felt something break open inside him. I do not know how, he said. Then let me help you. Word spread quickly in circles where silence was currency. The Duke of Westmere had been seen with Lady Vale. More than once. More than propriety allowed. The whispers were not cruel, not yet, but they were pointed, speculative, interested. At a garden party the following week, Imogen felt the shift. She stood near a rose arbor, teacup in hand, listening to Lady Pemberton discuss the upcoming season with practiced enthusiasm. But beneath the pleasantries, she sensed the change, the way conversations paused when she approached, the way eyes followed her movements, the way smiles became just slightly sharper. It is refreshing, Lady Pemberton said, her tone light, to see His Grace finally take an interest. One does worry about a man who remains unmarried for so long. I am sure the Duke has his reasons, Imogen replied evenly. Oh, certainly. And who could blame him for being selective? A man of his position must be careful. Lady Pemberton's smile was warm, but her eyes were calculating. Though I must say, Lady Vale, you are more resilient than you appear. The words were carefully chosen, the implication clear. Imogen felt the sting, but kept her expression neutral. She had survived worse than veiled insults at garden parties, but the damage was done. By the time she departed, she had received 3 fewer invitations than usual, and the conversations had grown noticeably shorter. She was no longer invisible. She was marked. Julian noticed too. At a small dinner 2 days later, a guest, Lord Ashford, emboldened by wine, made a veiled comment about widows who know how to wait. The table fell silent. Julian set down his glass with deliberate care and stood. His voice was cold, his words precise. Lady Vale is a guest in my home because she is intelligent, principled, and kinder than this company deserves. If that troubles anyone, the door remains open. Lord Ashford paled. The other guests stared at their plates. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and absolute. Julian did not sit down until Lord Ashford rose and left. But the damage was done. The defense was noted. The association was confirmed. Imogen had become a liability. That evening, after the other guests had departed, she found Julian in the library. He stood by the fire, one hand braced against the mantelpiece, his posture tense. I will not be returning, she said quietly. He turned to face her. Because of what I said, because of what it means. And what does it mean? That you have claimed me, publicly, whether you intended to or not. Julian crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from her. I did not claim you. I defended you. In this world, there is no difference. He was silent for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. I will not apologize for refusing to allow you to be insulted in my home. I did not ask you to protect me, Imogen said. I know. Then why? Because you should not have to ask. She looked at him, this careful, burdened man who had spent years punishing himself for sins he did not commit, and felt something break open inside her. I will not be your penance, Julian. It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed. She saw the recognition in his eyes, the way his breath caught. You were never meant to be, he said quietly. Then what am I? He did not answer. Perhaps because he did not know. Perhaps because the answer was too dangerous to speak aloud. Imogen turned toward the door. I cannot do this, whatever this is. I have worked too hard to rebuild my life to risk it on something that may be nothing more than guilt dressed as affection. It is not guilt. Then what is it? Julian took a step closer, then stopped, as though an invisible barrier had risen between them. I do not know, but I know it is not guilt. Imogen looked at him one last time, at the tension in his shoulders, the honesty in his eyes, the careful distance he maintained even now, and felt her resolve waver. But she had learned, in the years since her husband's death, that survival required discipline, and discipline meant walking away from things that could destroy you, no matter how much you wanted them. Good night, Your Grace, she said. She left before he could respond. A week passed. Imogen did not return to Westmere House. Julian did not write. She told herself it was for the best, that the connection between them had been circumstantial, born of proximity and shared solitude, rather than genuine affection, that she had been wise to end it before it became something more complicated. But then, by chance, she heard something. It was at a charity meeting, a gathering of women discussing fundraising efforts for a local orphanage. The conversation had turned to recent donations, and someone mentioned the Duke of Westmere's continued generosity toward families affected by historic financial hardship. The phrase was bland, bureaucratic, but it caught Imogen's attention. She made inquiries, discreet ones. What she learned stunned her. Julian had been systematically reducing the income from his estate for years, redirecting funds toward anonymous reparations. He had done so without announcement, without recognition, without seeking praise or acknowledgement. He had been quietly dismantling his inheritance, piece by piece, trying to repair damage his father had caused decades ago. The scope of it was staggering. Not just a few symbolic gestures, but a sustained, deliberate effort that had cost him significantly. He lived well, certainly. The trappings of his position required it. But he had given up far more than anyone knew, and he had told no one. Imogen sat in her drawing room that evening, staring at the notes she had taken, and felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness. She was not certain forgiveness was hers to give, but understanding. This was not guilt dressed as affection. This was a man who had been trying for years to do the right thing in the only way he knew how. In silence, in secret, without asking for recognition or absolution, and she had walked away from him. She returned to Westmere House the next afternoon, unannounced. The butler seemed unsurprised to see her. He directed her to the music room, a small sunlit space at the back of the house that she had never entered before. She found Julian there, seated at a piano with the lid open. He was not playing. Instead, he was reviewing a stack of documents spread across the bench beside him. Steward reports, income statements, lists of names. Her husband's name was among them. Julian looked up as she entered. He did not seem surprised. "You have been doing this all along," she said. "Yes, and you told no one. It was not meant to be known." Imogen crossed the room slowly, her eyes on the documents. Why not? He closed the folder carefully, setting it aside, because silence felt like justice. But it was only fear. Fear of what? Of being seen for what I am, the son of a man who caused harm, the inheritor of something I cannot undo. You are not your father, I know, but I am still responsible. Imogen looked at the piano, the papers, the light falling across his hands. She thought of all the years he had spent carrying this burden alone, trying to make right something that could never be fully repaired. "Is this justice, Julian?" she asked quietly. "Or is it just another kind of hiding?" He did not answer. "You asked me not to be invisible," she continued. "But you are still hiding. Not from the world. From yourself." He met her eyes, and for the first time, he did not look away. "I did not know how to stop," he said. "Then let me help you." It was not a declaration. It was not a rescue. It was simply a choice, one adult offering another a way out of the dark. Julian stood slowly. He crossed the room, stopping in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the steadiness. "I do not deserve this," he said. "Perhaps not," Imogen replied, "but I am offering it anyway." He reached for her hand, not to hold it, just to touch it briefly, with the tips of his fingers. It was the smallest gesture. It changed everything. "I have been trying to earn forgiveness," he said quietly, "but what I needed was to forgive myself. Yes, I do not know if I can. Then we will learn together." He looked at her, this quiet, dignified woman who had every reason to walk away, who had instead chosen to stay, and felt something inside him finally ease. "Thank you," he said. Imogen smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, but genuine. "You are welcome." They stood together in the music room, sunlight falling through the windows, the city humming beyond the walls. Two people who had spent years carrying invisible burdens, finally setting them down. Not because the burdens had disappeared, but because they had chosen together to carry them differently. The rumor did not disappear, but it lost its edge. Imogen began to appear at Westmere House again, not as a secret, but as a presence. She did not hide. Neither did Julian. They attended events together, spoke openly, allowed the world to draw its own conclusions. Some whispered, some speculated, but the sharpness faded, replaced by something closer to acceptance. The Duke of Westmere had made his choice. Lady Vale had made hers. And if society did not entirely approve, it at least recognized that the matter was settled. 3 weeks later, at a formal dinner, the same woman who had once asked the question tried again. Perhaps she had forgotten. Perhaps she simply could not resist. "Tell me, Your Grace, how many women have you truly loved?" This time, Julian did not deflect. He did not offer wit or irony. He simply looked across the table at Imogen, who sat with quiet grace, her eyes meeting his with perfect understanding. "One," he said clearly. "Who?" "The one who refused to let me hide." The room stilled. But this time, the silence was not scandalized. It was reverent. Imogen did not blush. She did not look away. She simply held his gaze. And in that quiet exchange, the whole room understood. This was not scandal. This was truth. And truth, when spoken with courage, had a power that rumor could never match. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, and the house had fallen quiet, Imogen and Julian stood together in the entrance hall. A footman brought her cloak, and Julian took it, draping it over her shoulders with the same careful attention he had shown weeks ago. But this time, when his fingers brushed her glove, he did not pull away. He adjusted the button at her wrist, then let his hand rest there, warm and steady. "Stay," he said quietly. It was not a command. It was a question. Imogen looked at him, at this man who had learned, finally, to stop punishing himself, to accept grace he had not earned, and felt something settle inside her. "Yes," she said. Weeks later, in the same music room where truth had finally been spoken, Imogen and Julian sat together in the late afternoon light. A single candle burned on the windowsill, left over from the evening before, when they had stayed too late talking and forgotten to extinguish it. The wax had pooled in uneven layers, the flame steady and small. Julian reached over and pinched it out with 2 fingers, the gesture quick and decisive. "No more penance," he said. Imogen closed the piano lid with the flat of her palm, the sound soft and final. Only truth. Outside, the city hummed with its endless rhythms. Carriages rattling over cobblestones, voices rising and falling, the 1,000 small sounds of life continuing. Inside, 2 people who had spent years carrying invisible burdens finally set them down. They did not speak of love. They did not need to. Love, they had learned, was not the absence of cost. It was the willingness to pay it, together. Julian turned to face her, his dark eyes warm in the fading light. "I have something for you." He crossed to a small desk and retrieved a document, a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed. He handed it to her carefully. Imogen broke the seal and read. It was a formal transfer of property. The house her husband had lost, the one she had thought sold years ago. It had been quietly repurchased, held in trust, and now returned to her name. She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Julian, it was always yours," he said quietly. "I was simply holding it until you were ready." She set the document aside and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "You have spent so long trying to make things right. When will you allow yourself to simply be happy?" "Now," he said, "with you." She smiled, a real smile, full and unguarded. "Then we have work to do." "What kind of work?" "The kind that builds rather than repairs. The kind that looks forward rather than back." Julian pulled her closer, his arms encircling her waist, his forehead resting against hers. "I do not know how to do that." "Neither do I," Imogen admitted. "But I think we can learn together." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's warmth, the room quiet around them. Outside, the light began to fade, twilight settling over London like a benediction. And in that small, sunlit room, 2 people who had spent years in shadow finally stepped into the light. Not because they had earned it, not because they deserved it, but because they had chosen it together.